So first, for those of you in the audience who haven't seen me because we have been remote for the last 2 or 3 years, my name's Rob McClellan and I'm the division head in cardiology, and it's my pleasure today to introduce the Jack and Nadine Murray speaker. And just before I get to Dr. Herman, I just want to say just a little bit about Jack and Nadine. They have been longstanding friends and supporters of the division and have sponsored this annual lectureship, which is really one of our preeminent invited lectureships. And we were so excited when Dr. Herman agreed to come and chat with us. Jack was one of the original faculty members in the Division of Cardiology and actually got our cath program started about 40 or 50 years ago, and they have continued to support us and support this lectureship, so I'd like to thank them. And now I'd like to just introduce Dr. Murray, who I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time this morning and finding out all the ties he had, including one to Larry Dean, which I've heard more about. Dr. Murray is one of our best-known cardiologists and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, who currently serves as the endowed professor and director of Cardiovascular Research Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine. He has had a long-standing research interest on the health of marginalized people and has published in not only our best scientific journals like JAMA and Nature, but in lay publications as well, like New York Times and National Geographic. He has too many publications to mention, but I would like to just point out a couple of additional items. He was the founding director of the Jackson Heart Study, which has made a really amazing contributions to our understanding in cardiovascular disease. He moved to Morehouse in his role and has continued his interest in cardiovascular disease in marginalized communities there, and he shared with us some of the information or new data from the study he is doing called MECCA. I'm not sure if he's intending to study about it, but I will say, it was really interesting because, we all live, us as scientists and doctors, in our own world. And so it's really great when an example of a study and a program where there are really multiple disciplines getting involved, and there's just really convergence and collaboration from basic science through population health to really make sort of an impact and result in new insights. And I think that's why there was so much enthusiasm for the talk, Dr. Herman's, Dr. Taylor's talk this morning. And so I'm hoping he's at least going to tell us a little bit more about it. So thank you, Herman. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that kind introduction. And thank you all for allowing that technical delay. It's a long story. Construction outside my office on campus compelled me to deliver this talk from my home, where rarely, and I mean extremely rarely, do we have things like power outages, but of course we had one today. So the last 15 minutes have been me commuting in afternoon Atlanta traffic to get back to campus to find a secure location from which to deliver this talk. But all of that is minor compared to the opportunity that you present me with today to talk about an issue that I think has a lot of currency. It has been on the minds of all of us to one degree or another. Both precision medicine, which is like the coming wave of a brave new medical world, and the old questions surrounding race, and whether these are compatible, mutually enforcing, or incompatible. are the topics that we'll cover today. Right after I get past my shameless plug here of a book that I've had a great, taking great pleasure in producing with Carlos Rodriguez and Keith Ferdinand, that you can call my office if you need more information about. Again, shameless plug. So today, we're going to consider for a few moments how race frustrates precision medicine and what to do about it. Let me admit from the outset that this is an overpromise. I think that by the end of the talk, I will have made some suggestions about what to do about it, but I do not pretend to have all the answers. I will speak to you from my experience. I'll speak to you from literature, and hopefully we can talk about some of these issues. At the very least, I want to stimulate your thinking to perhaps get past what you're usually comfortable with thinking or usually considering in the course of a busy day taking care of patients, fighting disease, and trying to make the world overall a better place. First, let me acknowledge that you guys come from a very diverse city. You are taking care of a population that is known for its diversity, and I congratulate you in your long-standing record of success in doing that. Increasingly, America is looking more and more like Seattle in that waves of immigrants, internal migration, and even the melding of races. The number of people who consider themselves biracial or multiracial is increasing dramatically with each generation. All of these things make race and ethnicity a current issue, even though there's a lot of fuzziness around the edges when it comes to defining actually what race is. Precision medicine, in some ways, is sort of an antithesis of things like race, in that what we're going for in precision medicine is to get away from the old paradigm wherein doctors and other caretakers who were concerned about disease prevention and treatment based the recommendations, the actions they took on the expected response of a, quote, non-existent average patient. Precision medicine takes the innovative approach and wants to take into account individual differences in patients' genes, environments, and lifestyles. So on the face of it, precision medicine is a bold and brave undertaking. And we have come, when we think about it, to think of multiple, and I mean multiple streams of data feeding into the classical assessments of health and disease, all funneling through these lakes of data and knowledge networks that we sometimes refer to as data commons, letting that educate us about our approach to the patients, as well as where the next steps in efforts at discovery, enhancing our understanding of human biology and its interactions with the types of things that we consider therapeutic. So again, a brave new world.
Miller?
Yes.
I apologize for interrupting. Can you try and reshare your screen and your slides?
Oh gosh, so you haven't seen a thing? Okay, hang on. We're going to get through this together. 1 second. To reshare. Okay. New share.
Yeah. Yeah. If you move to presentation mode, that would be great.
All right. You guys are kind and indulgent. Let me just put that out the way. Okay. All right. I hope you didn't read my notes. I want to keep the suspense as long as I can. Okay. So we were saying that indeed this is a brave new idea. this notion of precision medicine. And in some ways, race may be seen as antithetical. But is there something to be learned with both an understanding of race and the new approaches that constitute 21st century medicine? Again, these are multiple. And as you see from the diagram, we have multiple data streams that are filtered through these data commas, potentially that will feed back not only our initial approaches, our ongoing approaches to patients, as well as the fodder for future investigations and help shape those investigations, the frameworks, how we interpret the data that derives from them. So, but again, as I said, race, as opposed to something like the dream of precision medicine, is a very fuzzy concept. Race is not at all precise, and there are multiple definitions of race. Some think, like I think the Supreme Court justice who described obscenity, saying you know it when you see it. Some people think that that's enough in terms of determining what constitutes one race or another. More often than not, race is something that a person self-identifies, but that self-identification is closely tied to the race that is assigned to you by society, the culture, and so forth. But consider briefly these definitions. A group of people united or classified together on the basis of common history, nationality, or geographic distribution. Any one of the human groups that are often divided based on physical traits regarded as common. A construct, finally, this is from the National Academy of Medicine, construct of human variability based on perceived differences in biology, physical appearance, and behavior, not a biological reality. And I think that's an important phrasing. That doesn't mean that there are absolutely no potential differences that array along lines of continental origin, but that is a minor part of what we see as race today. And so the question is race relevant in an era of precision? Race, again, is a height of biological imprecision. However, race is reliably associated with health risk. And that is not a uniquely American phenomenon. If you just simply go across the water to the UK, we see race rearing its head as an important variable. Look, for instance, at these data from early in the COVID epidemic in the UK, and you can see that, again, populations that tend to be marginalized are, in fact, during their COVID epidemic, much like ours, suffering the worst end of the epidemic with significantly higher rates of mortality, 95%, 117% greater than the population, the white English population. Research analyses by race are universally performed and often used for hypothesis generation. That's probably one of the best uses of these observations. But who hasn't read a paper or multiple papers that at some point in the discussions or conclusions, a phrase like the ones arrayed here on the right of the slide is written? Independent of traditional risk factors, African American individuals have a 2 to 3-fold increase in risk, even after adjusting for relevant potentially confounding variables, and so it goes. And Black Americans are twice as likely for this bad outcome. Those types of phrases are run rampant through our literature and are useful in that they are important in focusing our attention on an important pattern. Race is also used as a guide to things like assessment risk, a guide in diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. And at the height of controversy currently has been race adjusted and race normed diagnostic tools or prognosticators or other things that other tools of the trade that can be used to guide therapy. And witness the heart failure score this heart failure score, which adds 3 points to the risk score of a patient who's identified as non-Black. The original study envisioned a score to increase the use of recommended medical therapy in high-risk patients and reduce resource utilization in those at low risk. The race correction, mind you, regards Black patients as lower risk and may raise the threshold for using clinical resources. And if history tells us, just as a brief aside from that, if history tells us anything, Black patients, and the numbers don't lie, are at incredible risk from death for heart failure, more so than the white population. And and if you look at work over the past decade, I think that point's been made frequently. So we have to regard with care these types of things. But back to the point of whether race is relevant, I think this is an important consideration as we work our way through this thinking. There is a large and growing literature that resoundingly converges on a consensus that social determinants of health are really critically important. And you see a list here that is common. And you see that in the pie chart that genetic predisposition is important. But if you look at social circumstances, environmental exposure, and behavioral patterns, all of that fall under the umbrella of social determinants, they're incredibly important and cumulatively the lion's share of what determines health and disease for Americans. And I challenge you to look across the list and find one thing that race does not impact, influence, or drive. And I think the simple point is that race matters. It matters in this era, it has mattered in the past, and the development of precision medicine cannot be pursued in a vacuum or in a colorblind manner. So why does race matter? And this next slide will be jarring to some and perhaps controversial, but I think I can make the argument that it's absolutely true, that race per se is not the problem. Racism is. The reaction to the race of an individual. How does society organize around race? How does society align resources, opportunities, and the possibilities of living a healthy life, accessing adequate care, and preventing health problems along the lifespan? How does that reaction impact the health of African Americans in this case, and certainly the argument can be made for others? These are words that are fraught, words that can change the temperature in a room if they're uttered in conversation, words that inspire defensiveness, anger, and other things, because unfortunately we are a radically racialized society. That doesn't mean we don't get along, but these are the facts. And it's important to make this distinction early. One, that racism is a dominant feature of the exposome that African Americans are living today, in the recent past, and in the distant past. And when we think of racism, we often think of some of these awful pictures which depict oppression, terrorism, social ostracization, and name calling, these sort of interpersonal types of insults, which clearly have a remarkable impact and erode, I think, our social fabric. But also, this is not racism writ large. This is the tip of an iceberg that has much more profound impact. I repeat, racism is a dominant feature of the exposome for African Americans and other groups. And I put the dates dating from the arrival of the first Africans in America, what came to be the United States. It's important, though, to expand your view beyond the things that make headlines as the most egregious forms of racism. In fact, that's not where the money is. I mean, I would love to wave a wand and make all of that go away. But racism, in the words of Kamara Jones, a former member of our institute here, is a system of power that structures opportunity and assigns value based on so-called race, the social interpretation of how we look. The important impacts are unfair disadvantage for some, unfair advantage for others, and for all of us, a waste resources. Now, how can racism impact health? There are multiple pathways, of course. There are enduring racialized structures and fragile protections that align with race and that produce persistent health risks. Residential segregation, well, you see the list here, and we could spend the balance of the talk going down this list, but I invite you to consider at least some of them. The impact of residential segregation has been well discussed by David Williams and many others. And I think the case is clear that this is a major way that racism has been put into the system, such that it doesn't matter whether you like or tolerate a person of a different race. That's irrelevant because the system is at work. It has gotten into the way that things are. It's gotten into the fabric, and it doesn't require interpersonal insult or affronts. Disempowerment, miseducation, and then we get to health care inequalities and opportunities for healthful living, which are impaired for many in the African American community. We've talked a little bit about interpersonal racist encounters and some of the immediate physiologic consequences of those, and which are quite real and well documented in many studies. And of course, the chronic maladaptive epigenetic changes that are some in some ways theoretical, but in some ways there is accumulating evidence that these things too matter. And I guess this is such a dramatic slide that I wanted to include this to point out the fact that things got so bad about 30 to 40 years after slavery was ended that people were predicting the very extinction of African Americans. Some of the rationale was that now that they were not under the watchful and careful care of slaveholders, that essentially they run amok, they breed with themselves without our attention to how well they can select their mates and so forth, and then it'll be unsupervised and things are going to go from bad to worse. In fact, what happened sequentially in time was the withdrawal of protections of Reconstruction, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of terrorism, the disenfranchisement in terms of removal of the vote in the states where Blacks were plentiful, and the lack of a healthcare system. These people were turned out with absolutely no resources, and things got to the point where this esteemed statistician, who thought because he was of German extraction could look at the situation with a certain dispassion and objectivity, came to the conclusion that Blacks were on the road to extinction. And this is the same guy who very presciently predicted the association between tobacco and lung cancer 70 years before the Surgeon General published his report. So this wasn't an academic lightweight, but that was how it looked at its worst. So I'm delivering a lot of sobering and perhaps challenging words here. But one thing I want to say, in fact, that when we look at health disparities, This is an unsurprising tragedy. Of course, there are health disparities. Dr. W. Du Bois put it simply and elegantly at the turn of the 20th century. One thing we must, of course, expect to find is that there's a higher death rate among Negroes than among whites. They have lived in the past under vastly different conditions, and they still do. Continuing on this line for just a couple slides more, it's also apparent that this is not, as some have suggested, a mere effect of poverty and the disproportionate levels of poverty among African Americans. As this slide demonstrates quite clearly, that Blacks in the highest percentile of income have comparable mortality comparable mortality overall as do whites in the next to lowest SES percentile. Here are the most well-off African Americans at 262. Here are the poorest whites who are actually just a little worse off than right here, the poorest whites. They're actually most comparable to, at least the second poorest are most comparable to the richest and most well-off African Americans. So that SES improvement has not inoculated African Americans against some toxicity in the exposed zone. And I argue that that toxicity is tightly tied to racism. Okay, so 89 years after the nadir that I showed you two slides ago, a very important landmark was reached, and that was the Heckler Report, which actually came out of the Reagan administration by Secretary Margaret Heckler, who was urged to do this, I might add, by the leaders of historically Black medical schools and colleges who were interested and concerned about what they were aware of already, and that is health disparities. Dr. Heckler commissioned this multi-volume report called Black and Minority Health, and in her opening letter, she talked about the situation. She said Americans were living longer, infant mortality was on decline, and everything was looking rosy unless you looked at African Americans and minorities. That there was a continuing disparity, which she called an affront to our ideals and to the ongoing genius of American medicine. That document came out actually while I was in some very formative years of my own career. It impacted me and a whole generation greatly in terms of trying to understand and get to the bottom of health disparities. I'm going to take you to the Jackson Heart study in just a moment, where I spent a good portion of my career. But I will say that on the way to the Jackson Heart study, you can draw a straight line from the Heckler Report to us doing the Jackson Heart study almost 20 years later. There was a difficult road. There were many impediments to trust, and that word will necessarily come up again towards the end of this conversation. And I think many of you are familiar with the Tuskegee study, and I don't think I have to elaborate on how that abuse of African Americans by the U.S. Public Health Service to study syphilis in its pure form without being treated by penicillin and other things that might disrupt the natural history of the disease, how that impacted African American attitudes. But you know, we put perhaps too much on that study by itself, because it's not in isolation. It's in a context where you have a country that will, for reasons that are mind-boggling, work against the self-interest of its population. The sickest part of the country, and I don't mind saying this because I was born and raised there, is the Southeast. It's also the most conservative politically. And it's also the part of the country that's most resolute in refusing things like Obamacare. And the perception of African Americans when they look at that, when they see a Black president's name attached to it, when they see and understand that it would be better if we had it, but that elected officials are fighting against it. That's not a context for building trust in the people who are working for your health or who purport to have your interests at heart. Why should I volunteer for a study, an experimental study, or a study, an observational study like Jackson Hartstead? Why should I volunteer for that when you won't even take care of my medical needs? You want me to be in a medical experiment, but you don't want to take care of my medical needs? Does that make sense? People have thought about this as well, and the fact that this is necessary is another part of the indictment. The picture here is one of my friends, and one of the people who paved the way for the Jackson Hartstead, Dr. Robert Smith, who founded a group back as far as I think most of our memories don't extend, that was fighting for the rights of African American physicians to be allowed practice privileges in local hospitals in Mississippi. He also helped organize the healthcare for many of the volunteers who were coming to Mississippi to help get voting rights for African Americans in that state in the 60s. And Robert is still around, still a rabble rouser, still as sharp as a tack. But the fact that his career has had to be devoted to bulldozing his way to the rights that he should have expected as an American citizen really does, unfortunately, create a challenge for those of us who were trying to do medical research in a part of the country that needs it the most. The attitudes that emerge are things like the survey that we took before they launched the Jackson Heart Study that revealed a smallish majority agreed that medical research treats people fairly. That means that a large minority don't think medical research is done fairly. The question of whether Black people put themselves at risk if they agree to participate was alive and well. This is right at the time that we were trying to start the Jackson Heart Study. Medical research is too hard for me to understand, otherwise it's a black box, which of course is not the attitude that will get you recruits to your work. That attitude was fairly rampant. And most ominous of all, medical research is a way for the government to keep Black people down. And this is an interesting minority, but it's not so much, it's not a fringe, lunatic fringe of people who think that way. In fact, at the time, you could get a really lively conversation out of African Americans who might have thought, some African Americans who thought that HIV was somehow engineered to target African Americans. That atmosphere has an anecdote that I will talk to you about later. So the Jackson Heart Study, all that to lead to the Jackson Heart Study. Now, we are I'm very proud of that book. And this occurred nearly 20 years after the Heckler Report when we started. The recruitment was not easy, but it was easier than it would have been but for the activism of our community and some of our special programs, which maybe we'll talk about again in the latter half of this talk. And this is what it entailed. And Jackson Heart Study is still alive and well, as many of you know. There have been major contributors from the University of Washington along our path of growth. But this is where we started in 2000 with a basic array of tests. This doesn't list all of the psychosocial and social cultural assessments done in standardized and validated surveys. In round one, about 3 years later, we had sort of Jackson Heart Study Light, where we got just a limited number because this initial assessment was 5.5 hours. We were really afraid that people would never come back after actually experiencing 5.5 hours in the clinic, talking to us and being poked and prodded. Amazingly, 90% of the people returned 3 years later to get that, and that owes to work a lot of wonderful people who work tirelessly maintaining the levels of retention that we all benefit from. Scientists at UW, scientists at Jackson, Atlanta, and across the world, for us working together with the community to get this deeply phenotyped and large sample. And the last exam that I supervised was exam 3. And again, it was a full bore Jackson Heart Study assessment. And that's yielded important things on this path to this notion of precision medicine, I think are quite important. And let me point out that, again, this is a race-conscious, all African-American study that is yielding important data that will feed into this brave new world of precision medicine. And time won't allow for me to go into each of these in detail, but some of these early papers that are principally cross-sectional were indicating what people suspected about the profound impact of social determinants on African-American health, even within the race group, and not, and this is, I think, one of the strengths of Jackson Heart, it's not set up to be a comparison to anybody. I had a question this morning about our dreams or our hopes for health, and why should it be based and indexed on what happens for white Americans, when in fact, the health of white Americans does leave something to be desired when placed on the world stage. I think it's important for us to focus on African Americans, not as an afterthought, not as a comparison group, but for what is going on, what dynamic forces are afoot that help determine their outcomes. And while the early studies were mostly cross-sectional, the longitudinal studies that give us a more important tie-in to causality and the potential weight of these risk factors, like perceived discrimination, point also to enhanced hypertension risk, for example, for people who report experiencing discrimination from on what's called lifetime discrimination versus stress from lifetime discrimination. Those things together have a substantial risk attached to them. And that's only one of the factors that are in the social determinants realm that are important. And again, a part of this exposome we talked about. Jackson Heart also contributed importantly to this data deficit, which is nicely illustrated here, where you see the large disproportion of information available from a genetic point of view for people who derive from Europe, and how while there's been some erosion of that predominance, you see that it's primarily from East Asians. But still, taking all minorities together, we still see that north of 80% of available genetic information, particularly from GWAS studies, derives from one specific part of the family of man, and leaves substantially unexplored the depth and variety and diversity that is represented in the African genome. I want to also say that the Jackson Heart Study is importantly contributing in that area. And I want to just pause here to note that UW investigators have been very important in this. And just a note of acknowledgement about the contributions of Dr. Debbie Nickerson in her lifetime to our work. And I would also add that there are many others on the UW faculty, and I'm going to forget someone, but notably, I want to point out the work of Bruce Pasady and the work of Alex Reiner as being important in the contributions that we've been able to make in genetics. Again, looking at that specific group, that race, in that location, Jackson. So again, very race conscious and very, very important and productive. Looking further down this path of health equity um, and the importance of race in the considerations around precision medicine, because ultimately what precision medicine aims to do is to make inequities a thing of the past, that everyone will get exactly what they need when they need it and the amount they need, such that we all are optimized when it comes to the potential for health. We've looked at this challenge in a different way. The Jackson Heart Study, of course, in its inception, was really focused on risk. As time and experience have evolved for me personally, I have taken a greater interest in what might be considered the opposite of risk, and that is resilience. And this notion that there is concentrated, perhaps, by virtue of the fact of this unnatural natural experiment, wherein a certain race of people are subjected to the things that African Americans have as a collective. How is it, where is it, and when does it occur that people evidence resilience despite adversity? Our beginning exploration into this we call MECA, which is a representative of the collaboration between myself and Dr. Arshad Kayumi and our respective faculty and postdocs to focus our attention on how disparities may actually give insight into resilience and some of the mechanisms that might be at play to protect certain individuals exposed to difficult circumstances from the consequences of those exposures. I had a hang up. Okay. The slides were delayed. I'm sorry. These are some of the publications that have come out in the last couple of years out of the MECA project. And what they suggest in total, by looking at comparable income locations across the Atlanta metro area, and here you see median Black incomes in the high risk and what we call resilient population, that you can, first of all, identify communities that have similar median income, but have vastly different outcomes in terms of cardiovascular mortality, ER visits, and admission rates to hospital for cardiovascular diagnoses. The comparisons of these communities and residents from those communities has yielded some early interesting results that I actually, Dr. McClellan mentioned that maybe I'd show you more about this. I don't have the detail here, but we certainly can begin to talk about it in the Q&A. That the suggestion is that indeed there are those individuals that do well despite their environment, and the social aspects of their existence and contextual aspects of their lives, what happens in their neighborhoods, what happens between them and their neighbors and so forth, social interaction, social cohesion, that those variables that may be considered soft ones by many in our community are actually very important for the preservation of health and the optimization of cardiovascular health, as measured by Life Simple 7 as an outcome for cardiovascular health. It's the beginning of this work, and we're excited about the results thus far. We are looking not only at the context and the social milieu and how people interact with each other, but we're also looking at individual biology, inflammatory biomarkers, looking at preclinical vascular disorders or derangement, and seeing how that relates to not only, again, contextual variables, but also individual variables and behavior. As shown in one of the diagrams earlier, the notion of precision medicine is also fed by real-time and increasingly dense data streams. And we are looking at this as well. And this is, again, a beginning foray for us. But we serve a population that is often not the focus of a lot of the technological capabilities for digital data gathering. And what we've done is, first of all, employ a common principle of going to the people that you want to serve and to help guide you as you go along your journey of discovery as an academic clinician. And what we've done in that regard, we like to call Moyo and the Moyo Health Network. And what the first step was for us to take a bare bones app that could assess many of the variables that enhance risk for young people for the development of cardiovascular disease. And we started this effort with young people, given their affinity for things technological, and the fact that 99.999% have smartphones. We gathered them together. We brought them together in intense, fun, entertaining environments for what we call health tech weekends. And I mean, there were DJs and food, the whole nine. But we put them in an environment where they were asked in a fairly intense way to ideate around what would be an optimal approach through cell phones to achieve the ends that we were discussing. And they also received education about their personal risk. And they were aware of the risk of their parents and their forebears. They all had stories about that. Invariably, universally, they had stories about it. And they were eager and ready to play around with what we got. And you see some of the typical, stickies on the glass door and boards. They did the wire framing and a whole lot of other things that they received instruction in over the course of the weekend. So using this as sort of our MO, we developed a Moyo base app. We modified it for pregnancy and Moyo Mom, and Morsana, which is a take on Morehouse, and Sana being a word for health, represents our COVID long haulers version of the base app. And some of the early publications are becoming available out of the early work, but we have high hopes for what's to come. Another frontier on the whole march to precision medicine that cannot be denied is machine learning and artificial intelligence. But why medicine now? Well, there are many reasons. I thought this was a good diagram that showed that we're rapidly exceeding what you can carry around in your head, and or even digest, even when you have access to it by other means. And this just looks at omics information that is being made available in an exponential fashion. It doesn't include some of the other streams of data that are depicted in this cartoon, such as the EHR, wearables, smartphones, and devices connected to the Internet of Things. All of these are new, novel, and sometimes overwhelming sources that need smart interpretation. Otherwise, there's a lot of noise out there in the universe. If we somehow can analytically approach this wealth of information, this quote big data, that is also part of this dream of precision medicine. And there's a real question as to whether this will represent an advance for everyone, or whether it will in fact enlarge the gulf between those who traditionally are marginalized and the ones who have traditional advantage in regards to health. Some of the areas that machine learning and AI offer promise are, I think, probably well known to a group from Seattle. All of these things are possible and already being explored in some data emerging as to whether or not they actually have real utility. But I think we can pause for just a moment to consider some of these words from some of the CEOs who are frequently looked to comment on the roles of technology in society. And I think both of them, well, one of them is particularly enthusiastic. He, at the verge of hyperbole, he says AI is one of the most important things humanity is working on. It's more profound than electricity or fire. That's getting to be pretty profound. But even after pointing to that excitement and registering that excitement, he says AI is really important, but we have to be concerned about it. Elon Musk put it more simply, we are summoning the devil. Words to consider. What devil is he talking about in terms of health? Well, we really don't have a full appreciation of it, but we have some inkling, some early signs that it can go wrong, and it can go wrong in a profound way. Most of you are probably familiar with the work out of the United Health Group, wherein they documented, in association with investigators from Mayo Clinic, they documented how things can go wrong, where data fed to a machine wound up suggesting that African Americans actually needed less care than their white counterparts. Of course, that data, that was as smart as the machine could be, but it was miseducated. The fact that it based the algorithm really wound up exposing historical patterns of underuse. It took that as like the ground truth that this is what was necessary. And when in fact, it is known, documented many times over that African Americans have chronically underutilized healthcare, underutilized resources, even if they were insured. The algorithm basically is saying, well, let's keep that like it is and keep going forward. And because, this is what is necessary. This is how it should be. Therefore, this means a certain allocation of resources is appropriate when it's fundamentally inappropriate and a part of the disparities picture. So we have to be careful as the machines begin to become more a part of the process of us understanding the data that's available to us and planning for things ahead. To that end, we were recently awarded funding to be a part of Aim Ahead, which is a program that seeks to increase the participation and engagement of researchers and communities that are underrepresented in the modeling and applications of AI. And basically, put simply, it's about diversifying data sets as well as the people who analyze the data. Investigators and data sets are woefully undiverse, if that's a word. And that is something that is a recipe for, I think, automated disaster unless we purposefully and intentionally attend to it. So, considering all of these trends, considering the fuzziness of race, considering the promise of precision medicine, is race in this equation a catalyst for precision or a confounder? I've given you examples of the Jackson Heart study in Mecca and others that are fairly race specific. And I think I'm making the case that race is an important reality, is an important part of the exposome that cannot be ignored. It may not be a reality biologically, but it is real. It has impact. It organizes how we think, and it reflects how society is organized. And for us to ignore that, ignore the role of racism, to ignore the role of how society is structured as we plan the future of precision medicine, is to be profoundly imprecise. Now, what to do? And this is the promise that I will not completely fulfill as we wrap up. I was pleased to see this on your website, and that is University of Washington Health Equity Blueprint that articulates three, I think, great principles: increase diversity, increase cultural humility, reduce implicit bias, engage the communities, and deploy targeted quality improvement in healthcare services to meet the needs of marginalized populations. Couldn't agree more. As Martin Luther King was quoted as saying, it's great to have things on thin paper. What matters is thick action. And I think part of that action is recognizing the indispensable, deeply valuable role of community consultation, involvement, some call it engagement. And here's my list. And it's going to start with a strange concept that included grand rounds, and that's love. I think loving and trusting the community is the first step in having the community trust you. And the trust of the community can yield dramatic results. I realize I'm getting very close to time, unfortunately, because of my delay. I will try to, unfortunately, rush through the end. I think rather than thinking in terms of color blindness is something to aspire to, I think embrace of race is important. I think, again, increasing the racial diversity in all human health databases, we talked about that, and AI and ML, and beyond that, genomic databases and so on. Exploring prevalent exposome risk embedded in belonging to historically oppressed groups, and acknowledging and addressing racism-based determinants, environmental circumstances, policies, and laws. We have a section here on legal epidemiology that is a novel approach to looking at how society is structured in a way that disadvantages minority groups. Let's see, to harness its power in implementation and dissemination, that is the community and race, that sometimes race is really critical in implementation. A simple example would be something like the barbershop initiatives out of Texas and Southern California that are documented to show improvement. In clinical decision making, particularly when faced with race norm algorithms, I think an attitude of erring on the side of caring is important. Any algorithm that effectively you perceive is denying or reducing opportunities for therapeutic intervention for the patient in front of you on the basis of race needs to be thought through extremely carefully. Obviously, rejecting racism, and I rate these suggestions along Dr. Jones's definition of racism. There are interpersonal issues, structural issues, and even the concept of internalized racism, where people are taking on the value assigned to them by society. That whole notion of underutilization of care, people need to be counseled and worked with not to let that continue. And I think the concept of resilience is one that the community should also be told of and taught and shown evidence for. Building the pipeline, this is a whole conversation in and of itself, but note the dearth of African American males in this case, who actually make it to medical school and go on to be practitioners. And note this one study that showed the value of having African Americans taking care of other African Americans. That is not to say that every Black person needs a Black doctor, but the presence of African Americans in the practice community is important. So now, I'll quickly show you just some of the people who've been involved in this work. Time will not allow me to name them all, but they are a group of dedicated, multi-institutional, multidisciplinary individuals who make this work possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. That was a really fascinating talk. And I know we're a little over time, but there are a few questions coming in. So I just want to make, if you have a moment, some time to ask a couple of them. Sure. One of our audience members is very grateful for the talk, great points, and has one question. what are your thoughts on Bidil, the medication? Does it make sense to have particular drugs for particular races, in this case, Black patients, particularly given the immense diversity of the Black population?
I think the question answers itself. There's an immense diversity. So on a group sort of level, it looks like Bidil for Black people makes sense. I think, the studies, particularly African American heart failure study, which is a fabulous study. It was great. I think most people know that there was no control group. There was no white arm to look at just how effective those drugs could be in white Americans as well. It is true that there are some polymorphisms that impact or impinge upon heart failure outcomes that occur more commonly in Blacks. And you may have a theoretical basis for expecting that particular drug to work better in people who self-identify as Black. However, heterogeneity must be borne in mind, right? And as we advance again towards this precision medicine ideal, just saying this drug is for Black people is grossly unmedical. I'll put it this way, it's imprecise. Now, the fact that those two drugs are proven to be efficacious in any is worthy of note. The fact that they're efficacious in Blacks means that those drugs should be available to African Americans and other people. By creating two commonly used drugs that were cheap before you put together the two drugs in a combination tablet, by making it more expensive, are you helping? Are you being equitable? I'm not sure. So I still think that use of isodil and hydralazine is incredibly important in everybody, particularly African Americans, as we define it generally. But I don't see that a Bidil as a specific Black drug is a concept that I can align my thinking.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. Again, thank you for your thoughtful answers, your fantastic talk. And I know we're at time here, so I will let you go. And thank you everyone for joining. It's wonderful to have you all, and have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Sorry for the delay.
Not a trouble at all. Don't worry.